Hi, everyone. Welcome to Chestnut Chat again. Today we are joined by Sandy Anagnostakis and Michael Nave, and we're going to talk about chestnut hybrids and cultivars and sort of both a historical and current and modern perspective. I'm recording the session, so if you put something in the chat, if you put something in the Q&A, if you are a panelist, if you share something on the screen, it's all going to be recorded, and we'll post it to the acf.org Chestnut Chat section. Only the panelists that you see here, Sandy, me, Lisa, Michael, Kendra, they're the only ones who can actually mute and unmute themselves and show their screen. So the rest of the folks who are attendees, we can't hear you, we can't see you. If you want to communicate with us, please use the chat to just chat and say stuff. Use the Q&A module to ask a question. I'll be monitoring the Q&A and holding most of the questions for the end of the session when we'll have a conversation with our panelists. Kendra will also be monitoring the Q&A. If there's something that doesn't really need to be answered live, she'll answer them by typing in the answer. I'll also let you know that as attendees, you can upvote questions. If you think one's particularly intriguing, please give it a thumbs up so that moves to the top, and I'll ask that first. You can also interact and type your own answer, make comments in any of the Q&As as you like as well. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa, and then we'll get our program started.
Thanks, Sarah. Welcome, everyone. Rock stars indeed. Boy, this is one of our most highly attended Chestnut Chats, I think, Sarah. And a lot of people in the chat are saying, hey, Sandy, and hey, Mike. So really glad to have you there with us today. I'm here in Asheville, North Carolina. I think one of the few places, at least on the panelists, that doesn't have snow on the ground. But it is a beautiful winter day, and my Nordic genes rejoice in the winter time. I just love winter. I love that Sandy's here because she actually is the original Madam Chestnut. Madam Chestnut is my nickname now. It's actually my Twitter handle, but I can't hold a candle to Sandy and her long, illustrious career studying this iconic species. So welcome, Sandy. Mike, I don't know as well, but I hear you're a rock star as well, and I'm anxious to hear about your history with chestnuts. So without any further ado, are we gonna upload a PowerPoint, Sarah? What's the next step?
Yeah, so Sandy's gonna go first, and then she has a great segue into Michael. So Sandy, you can go ahead and take it away. And again, I'm gonna hold, unless there's something really burning, I'm gonna hold questions until after Michael, but we'll see how things go.
Okay, here we go. I'm going to start out by noticing that since we're talking about hybrids and cultivars, I thought I should give a few definitions just to make sure everybody understands what we're talking about. When we say hybrids, that means a cross between two different or more species. Now, the genus Castania has species all around the world in the temperate zone. There's one species in Europe, one species in Japan and North Korea. There's at least 3, if not more, species in China. And there are at least 5 species native to the United States. Now, people don't think about that very often, but those are a lot of species that are available in the genus Castania. And unlike what you learned in biology, you were told that species couldn't cross with each other. But in the genus Castania, all of the species can cross. So that means we can get hybrids between the species. And that's one of the things we're going to be talking about. And then we have cultivars. A cultivar is a clone. Castania, for the most part, you can't root cuttings. And if you can't root cuttings, how do you clone a tree? Well, you have to graft it onto acceptable rootstock. And the process of grafting is not always easy, but you can graft hybrids or cultivars, hybrids that are known cultivars, onto a rootstock and get those to grow. Those are called ramets. The original cultivar is called the ortet. So we have the original cultivar, the ortet, and then all of its grafted offspring, which are ramets. So how do you name a cultivar? First of all, you have to have a tree that you think is really outstanding, and you want to make sure that everybody can grow this tree and appreciate it. So you're willing to distribute its ramets, its grafted clones, and you graft a whole bunch. You make sure that the grafts are going to succeed. And then you look at my list on my webpage, which I'll show you at the end. And there's a list of all of the named cultivars that are accepted by the International Society of Horticultural Science. So you look at that list and you say, I want to call my cultivar Betsy's favorite, which is a little awkward. So you look at the list and nobody has named something Betsy's favorite. So you send me the information and I discuss it with you and suggest maybe just Betsy would be easier. Nobody's named something Betsy, so you're allowed to name your cultivar Betsy. And you send me the information that this tree has been cloned, you have grafted it, the grafts are succeeding, preferably for more than 3 years, and have produced nuts. And then I will add cultivar Betsy to the list of accepted cultivars. So you can have a cultivar which is a hybrid. I would like to know what the background of that hybrid is. If you don't know, you can guess and tell me what you think it is. But a cultivar can also be a pure species. So that's the difference you see between hybrids and cultivars. We have cultivars that are hybrids and cultivars that are pure species. So let's talk about some of those. Here are some really old hybrids that are actually cultivars. I don't have these in Connecticut, but they're really important. So I thought you should know about them. First of all, we have cultivar Boone, which is a Crenata bidentata hybrid. It was a cross made by Endicott in Illinois. And he said that the Crenata was Japan giant, but some recent work on this particular planting has come up with the opinion that it was actually cultivar Co, which was a selection by Luther Burbank. Luther Burbank imported in 1880, he imported 10,000 nuts from Japan and grew them up and selected 3 seedlings as outstanding and grafted them and sent them off to a grower in Connecticut. One of them was named Co, and that was probably the Crenata Japanese parent of Boone. If you look at that picture of Boone there, you can see Mr. Endicott standing in front of the tree. Then another really important cultivar in the United States was Paragon, which was first called the Great American because, after all, it was growing in America. Various people have researched this and have decided that Paragon was actually a European by American hybrid. It was a nut planted by Schaefer in Pennsylvania. He said sometime before 1837, he couldn't remember when. The European chestnut was reputed to be something planted by George Washington, which wasn't surprising because people started importing chestnuts into the United States in very early. And the earliest records we have were Thomas Jefferson, who had European chestnuts in 1773. So it's quite possible that that was a very old European chestnut that crossed out to American chestnut to produce Paragon, which was then shipped all over the United States, both as seedlings and also as grafted cultivars. So you find Paragon in lots of places. And Greg Miller in Ohio has a tree that he's pretty sure is Paragon. It fits all the descriptions. And Jean Romero Severson, who is our premier DNA person looking at chestnuts, she's at Notre Dame. Jean says that the tree that Greg Miller has, it looks like it's half European and half American chestnut. So that pleased me. I'm glad that we still have something that looks like Paragon still alive. The other one on this slide is an Allegheny chinkapin, Castania pumila, by Japanese chestnut. This was a cross made by Van Fleet in New Jersey in the late 1800s, and it has been propagated in many ways all over the country. It was in row S, tree 8, and that's why it's called S8. So those are some of the very early hybrids that became cultivars. Here are some that we have in Connecticut. We have Sleeping Giant, which is relatively famous. This is a Chinese by European by Japanese by American hybrid. And it is pretty well known, not only because it has pretty good timber form, that is upright growth, but it also has good nuts. And you can still buy Sleeping Giant from a lot of different nurseries. We have Eaton, which is almost certainly a sibling of Sleeping Giant. This was one of those trees that Arthur Graves gave away to one of his friends, but it turned out to be a really good nut producer. And so Eaton has been cloned. It doesn't graft terribly well, but it's a pretty good nut producer. And we have ramets of that growing in Connecticut. And then one of my favorites is Cultivar Lockwood. It's mostly Japanese with a bunch of other species mixed in. It was from a cross in 1946 and planted at Lockwood Farm. You'll notice that things that are cultivars, names that are cultivars, we enclose them in single quotes. That's how you know that's a cultivar name. Here are some of the other cultivars in Connecticut. We have S8 Jap, which is a descendant of Van Fleet's S8. It is a cross from 1934, and S8 Jap was crossed with what was probably a seedling of S8 Jap, and then open pollinated again. But this is a really nice cultivar. It has good upright growth and apical dominance, but excellent nuts. And it has the advantage that it produces nuts very early in the season. And it's one of the few things that I've sent to Denmark, to the northern reaches of possible growth. And this one was the only one that has succeeded in the really cold regions of that area. Then we have Hope, King Arthur, and Madison, which are recent cultivar names. They're all prolific. They produce lots of nuts with a good rounded short stature. And my all-time favorite, Sadie Hunter. We thought Sadie Hunter was actually Sleeping Giant, but I think what happened was that Dick James planted a grafted tree there and the graft died. So this would be the root sprout, which was probably a seedling of Sleeping Giant. And Sadie Hunter, which is named after one of my granddaughters, by the way, Sadie Hunter produces prolific, excellent nuts. And one of the farm workers, who's a great friend of mine, Raleigh says that these are the best nuts on the farm. And I believe it. And then we have a picture of Little Giant, which I think is extremely important because it's a genetic dwarf. It's all of its seedlings come out to be dwarfs. You can see how short this tree is. It's been there for a long time, and it still stays relatively short. It has been used in Missouri, at the University of Missouri, as a dwarfing rootstock and as an interstem. I'm still waiting for all of that data, Missouri folks. But it's very nice that we have something that's a true genetic dwarf. I for a long time I was working on growing a patio chestnut, and I still think that's an important thing to have. Now, one of the advantages at Lockwood Farm in Hamden, Connecticut, is that I have planted cultivars, grafted cultivars, and besides that, we have all of the species of chestnut that I've been able to accumulate. So every time there's a new crisis, somebody brings in a new pest or a new pathogen, I can walk around Lockwood Farm and say, oh, look at that. That tree is dying from whatever, whereas that one over there is not. So this is something I've used to advantage over the years. I took over the chestnut breeding when Dick James retired because no one else wanted to do it. I had been working on the blight fungus for a long time. Remember, I've been there for 50 years. But the breeding of the chestnuts has become really important to me. So when Asian chestnut gall wasp first got into Connecticut, I walked around the farm and I noticed that a lot of the trees, especially those that were European or had lots of European genes, were very badly damaged by gall wasp. Whereas all of the chinkapins, the Chinese chinkapin and at least 4 of the American chinkapins were not damaged at all. So I figured, okay, the next thing we have to do is cross commercial chestnuts with chinkapins to get gall wasp resistance. Here's an example of colossal. You can see how much damage there is to the tree from gall wasp. Close up, you may be able to see individual galls. The tree has very few functional leaves. Here's Eaton. It was also damaged, but remember that Eaton's mother was probably Chinese. And then there's European, Japanese, and American in its background as well. It's hard to see the damage in close up, but I can tell you that it's there. but still Eton is surviving better. So first I crossed these two commercial chestnuts with the Chinese chinkapin, which is Castania henryi. This is a cross from 2011. The photo is from 2019. Here's a Colossal, and here's Eton crossed with henryi. Then I discovered, again, a photo from 2019 that these hybrids, although they still got galls from the Asian chestnut gall wasp, the gall would form and then the tree would basically ignore it and form a new branch. Now that was something that never happened in the susceptible species. So the next cross was with one of the American chinkapins, Castania Ozarkensis. These crosses were made in 2013. Photos in 2019. Here's Colossal by Ozarkensis and Eton by Ozarkensis. And the same thing happened. Here's a gall. The leaf at that gall died, and the tree made another sprout. And in fact, if you stand back and look at the tree, you see these bare spots where the leaves around the galls were killed, but the tree made more sprouts and continued to grow, and in fact fruited in that year. So this is good. We have a way of breeding for gall wasp resistance. And in order to pursue that, here are a couple of trees in my new hybrids planting. This poor little denuded tree is, let's see, it's American by Japanese by American. So it's a backcross, and it's got really serious damage from gall wasp. Right next to it is Ozarkensis, the Ozark chinkapin crossed with my favorite Japanese chestnut. And this tree has very abundant catkins. And I'm going to use it this year in crosses on all kinds of things, including my favorite Lockwood and Little Giant and Sadie Hunter. And we'll see what the next generation looks like and what kind of disease resistance and insect resistance these trees have. I'll plant them at Lockwood Farm because even though I'm retired, I am emeritus and they still let me hang around and do things there, which is good. Now, if you need information, here is my webpage. I suggest you go to the webpage and look at stuff because I have all of the information that I could gather on importations of species into the United States. I have the list of registered cultivars and all kinds of papers for people interested in what's going on with chestnuts in general. And there's also my email. Send me an email. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Sandy. That was excellent. There's some good questions. I want to not quite turn it over to Michael just yet. I want to ask a few questions for you from the Q&A. What do adult gall wasps eat?
Adult gall wasps probably don't eat very much. They feed as larvae inside the gall. Then they mature, come out, mate, and lay their eggs in the developing leaf and flower buds of the tree, so that when the buds break to make either flower buds or leaves, the gall is activated, the larvae, the eggs hatch, The larvae start to grow and form a large gall, and the leaf or flower bud is killed. As far as I know, the adult wasps don't eat anything, but we need an entomologist to answer that. And Lynn Risky-Kinney in Kentucky, don't give up. We expect you to answer these questions.
Greg says gall wasps don't mate. There are no males. And I also have bad news to report from the chat from Greg. He says that his Paragon grafts died shortly after he sent twigs to Gene, and he lost it after some 40 years. But he does have F1 offspring crossed with Chinese. So they live on, but not in that format.
Oh dear.
And we also have to report, and Hill confirms that they're all female.
Okay, so they don't need a boy gall wasp. They just go out there and lay their eggs.
Insects are crazy.
Yeah.
So one more question from Robbie Shaw, and then Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you. Do cultivar seeds reproduce identical offspring?
No, because cultivar seeds, I mean, the cultivar is the mommy, and someplace there's a daddy, because you can't have nuts formed without two different trees, because it takes two to tango. I keep telling people. So if you have a cultivar and you either on purpose cross it with something, or you let it sit there and get pollinated by the wind blowing pollen from wherever, you probably don't know who the daddy is. So what you're ending up with is either a known hybrid, because you've used specific pollen and protected the female flowers from other pollen. Then you have a known hybrid of that cultivar. If it's open pollinated, then you've got a cultivar crossed with an unknown daddy, and maybe the seedlings will be interesting. Grow them up and find out.
Thanks, Sandy. And Michael, I'm sorry, I'm going to hold you off for just a couple more minutes. A couple people have had trouble with that website, Sandy. So it looks like it's www.ct.gov/CAES/SLA.
Yes.
So I think we got that confirmed. I also want to pass on a comment from, where'd he go in here? Boyd. There he is. Boyd Cadle. He says, voice from the past, Boyd from Western Kentucky. Thanks for helping me find Japanese trees in LBL. There are 5 left. Thank you. So that was just a comment for you. And I think there's an excellent question in here from Robbie Shaw. And I'm not going to answer that just yet, Robbie, but I want to pose this to Sandy and Michael too. And I have my own opinion on this. But Robbie asks, doesn't the propagation of all these cultivars go to the detriment of the goal of the American Chestnut Foundation to breed American back to the chestnut range? Short answer, no. But I think that's a really interesting question. And the other reason I want to bring that up is I want to put in a plug, because I can, for next month's Chestnut Chat, where we're going to talk more about philosophy. What makes an American chestnut an American? What is the essence of an American chestnut? We're going to talk about native species versus non-native. We're going to talk about what restoration means. That's going to be a much squishier topic than what we're doing today. But I love that question. I want to get into it, not right now, but I want people to think about it while Michael talks. So over to you, Michael. Oh, wait, Sandy has a comment.
Let me just say that the GMO chestnuts that Bill Powell and company in Syracuse have produced are American chestnuts verified by Jean Romero Severson. They are American chestnuts that have this gene inserted, which make them produce something which resists chestnut blight. So if you're wanting pure American chestnuts, plant the GMOs. Otherwise, everything else is a hybrid.
Well, and you can't yet, Sandy. So
no, you can't yet. Just wait.
Sure, we can talk about that later too. But that, again, that's a bigger question of what makes an American chestnut and what makes a hybrid, and what, like, this question of quote unquote purity. we want to talk about that a little bit more next month. But so thank you for that comment, Sandy. We'll talk more about all of those things after Michael and also next month. And we're waiting for Michael to share. So as Michael's doing that, I want to let everybody know that you can go to the Chestnut Chat series website on ACF, and maybe Kendra can post that again. Michael has provided a Word document that he's going to be going through. You guys can all follow along. Check that out. You can also have that then for later, but all of that's available on the Chestnut Chat website. And Michael, I'm going to ask you to take it away.
Okay, is this sharing correctly? This should be the printed page.
Yes, it's still pretty small. If you go in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see a plus sign and 100%. You can tick that up and make the print pretty big, and that'll probably be better for people to see. I'd keep going. Keep going. Keep going. That's pretty good. Yeah, okay. Thanks, Michael.
Good deal. You don't have, for people who are looking at this, you don't have to be looking at this while I'm speaking, but it's just kind of a guide because I'm going to be speaking on these topics that I have listed here. But you can just listen and you don't have to read if you are having difficulty with it. One of the things that tends to happen when we start talking about cultivars is people want to immediately start talking about the individual named cultivars and what makes them special and what makes them bad and all those types of questions. But what I'm going to do, instead of going immediately to cultivars, I'm going to talk about what are the cultivar qualities that we're interested in, because in all the conversations I've had about this, we don't ever start out this way. We don't ever talk about the cultivar qualities we are looking for or the qualities we want to avoid. So I've made a couple lists here. One list is applicable mostly to the qualities of the trees, and the second list is applicable mostly to the qualities of the nuts. So with respect to the trees, what I'm going to start out with here is something very simple. Do these trees leaf out early or late? And if you're somebody who's growing chestnut trees in zone 9, you probably don't care about this. But if you're growing chestnut trees in other zones, particularly in zone 6, this could be a serious issue to you, whether your trees are going to leaf out early or late. If they leaf out too early, you're going to get hit by spring frosts. And if they are still maturing too late in the year, you're going to get hit by the early winter frosts. So right now, I'm not going to discuss which trees have these qualities, but I just want to bring these individual qualities to your attention. So this is very important, whether a tree leaves out early or late. Secondly, and related, is does a tree bloom early or late? Because some trees that leaf out early may not bloom early, and vice versa. And generally speaking, with respect to bloom dates, Cronata trees are going to bloom first, Melisma are going to bloom second, Dentata are going to bloom third, and European are going to bloom last. But within each species, there's a lot of variability. So you have a lot of trees are going to cross each other here. You have some Melismas that will still be blooming when the Europeans are starting. And you have to know your individual trees, but just generally, you do want to be aware of when your trees are going to bloom, particularly with respect to whether they're going to provide pollen for each other. And that brings us to this next category is, does your tree produce pollen? Does your cultivar produce pollen? Some don't. Generally, it's going to be the European trees and some hybrids that will not produce pollen. Do the nuts drop early or late? And again, if you're in zone 9, you probably don't care. But if you're in other shorter zones where you have a shorter summer, you are going to be concerned about when your nuts drop. And a related issue is, do your nuts drop all at once, or is the drop an extended drop? And when you grow enough chestnut trees, what you'll find out is that some trees are going to drop their nuts pretty much all at once. And by all at once, that means probably within a week to 10 days, all the nuts are going to be down. And I'm not saying that's a good quality or a bad quality. That depends on what you want in your tree. But it is a quality you need to be aware of. And some nuts are going to have a very extended drop. And I've had one particular tree I can think of that drops nuts over a 6-week period of time. So you want to be aware of, with respect to any cultivar, as to whether or not it has a very short drop period or a very extended drop period. And with respect to, picking up nuts for commercial purposes, you want to be aware of whether the nuts are going to fall free from the burr or they're going to fall in the burr. And this, again, is not necessarily a good or a bad thing. Either way, it just depends on what you need in a tree. Because in some areas, like when I was growing trees in California, I really preferred that the nuts would drop within the burr. And the reason for this is because nuts would be dropping in September, and it could be 110 degrees in September. And if you leave a nut out there for more than an hour or two in 110-degree heat, it's fried. Your nut is sunburnt, and it is going to deteriorate very quickly. So you would really prefer to have these nuts drop within the burr to be protected from the heat. On the other hand, if you have the manpower to handle this, and you have the nuts drop free, you can pick all of them up, within a couple hours when they drop. But again, it just depends on what you need and what you want. There was a tree that I was growing in California, and also this is not necessarily consistent. Whether they fall in the burr is not consistent from one climate to another. I've had trees that I grew in California that drop free, and when they're grown in other places like Tennessee, they're dropping in the burr. And it's not totally clear why this is different in different locations. I think part of it has something to do with humidity. Part of it has something to do with how well watered the trees are. But nonetheless, there will and can be differences from one climate to the next. Next up, we have just the size of your tree. Trees are very different in size. And this is a different than whether your trees are exclusively an orchard type or a timber type, because you can have orchard type trees that are small and you can have orchard type trees that are large. And I think that's down here lower on my list. Size of crop. And of course, this is one of the most important criteria for people who are going to be commercial growers, but you want to know whether the tree you produce is going to produce a good crop. And it's one of the interesting things about Sleeping Giant is that Sleeping Giant is a very high quality chestnut. And a lot of the seedlings produced by Sleeping Giant produce very high quality chestnuts, but a lot of the seedlings produce small crops. Not all, but a lot do. Cold hardiness. Again, if you're in zone 9, you don't care about this, but in other zones, this could be an issue. Heat units that you need to mature nuts in summer. This is primarily an issue for those of you who are going to be growing Millissima. Both European and American and Japanese Granada nuts do well in cooler summers. They can do well in summers where you don't have a lot of heat units. And particularly with Japanese will do very well in, say, Oregon or Washington State or the northeastern United States. They don't need a lot of heat units to produce good nuts. But with Millissima, if you try to grow Millissima trees in the state of Washington, the trees will grow very well, but you don't get heavy nut production, and the nuts you get are generally not very sweet and not very flavorful because you don't get enough heat units. Millissima just needs a lot more heat units to get quality nuts, generally speaking. There's always going to be a tree or two that, is going to be outside the average, but generally you need more heat units if you're growing Millissima nuts. Blight resistance. And I think everybody here knows about blight, but I think what some people are not completely aware of is when you're growing grafted trees and you're growing it in totally different climates and different cold hardiness zones, is that blight is not an absolute. And by that, I mean, the blight resistance is not an absolute, because you can grow a tree in a climate where the tree doesn't have a lot of winter pressure and it doesn't have a lot of gall wasp pressure, and it will handle blight and it will remain alive and may even be very productive even though it has blight. And you can grow that same graft in a different climate where it has a lot of difficulty in the winter. It may have drought problems in the summer, and blight may kill it. So blight resistance is not, a quality that is inflexible. a tree that can resist blight in one area may not be able to resist it in another area. Phytophthora, and this is one of those where, a lot of things here I've said people in zone 9 don't have to worry about it. This is something that people in zone 9 have to worry about. Phytophthora is generally a problem in warmer climates, and we're talking about zones 7 through 9. And it can be also in the warmer parts of zone 6 too, but generally you're going to have most problems. The warmer you get, the more problems you're going to have with Phytophthora. So if you're planting grafted trees, it's not just a matter of whether or not your cultivar is resistant, it's whether your rootstock is resistant. And in the United States, we don't have a very sophisticated or very complex method for propagating rootstock. I mean, in Europe, you can buy rootstock that is very Phytophthora resistant and graft your trees onto it. And here in the US, we still don't have that luxury. Whether or not a tree grafts well or not is an important consideration. As I think Sandy touched on earlier, Eaton has a very high quality nut, but it does not graft well. It has a higher number of graft failures to begin with. It has more delayed graft union failures. There's a lot of dead Eaton trees out there, dead Eaton grafts that are 10 years old. I mean, it's just difficult to keep it alive. This does not mean that you should not grow Eaton. It doesn't mean you can't grow Eaton. In the Facebook chestnut group, there is a grower in Missouri who has a couple of Eaton trees, and it is his favorite tree. And his trees are well over 20 years old, and they're heavily productive, and they have no sign of graft union failure. So, it can grow well. It's just that you need to be aware that there are trees out there that do have these graft union problems. The cultivar Ching also has some graft union issues. It's one of those you should not be surprised after 5 to 10 years if the graft dies on you in that respect as well. In the United States, we really don't have many discussions about rooting chestnuts because we don't do it very often and it's very hard to do. But in Europe, there are researchers in Spain and Portugal who have developed rootstock that does root, that can be rooted well, and they're starting to ramp up production of these. And I think one of these days we may see that in the United States as well. I think the difference, though, is that what they're doing in Europe is with basically sativa and sativa hybrids, which are far more vigorous and which root better than Millissima. So it may be a while before we see Millissima rootstocks that come from rooted chestnuts. Gall wasp susceptibility. Sandy gave a great presentation on this. There definitely are cultivars that gall wasps avoid, or if they infect them, they cause less damage. It's just something you need to be aware of. Although generally in the eastern United States, we have been lucky in that the gall wasp predators eventually do spread to cover areas where gall wasp is a problem and will reduce the problems with gall wasp. Another factor that you may or may not be interested in if you're a commercial grower is, does your cultivar produce good seedlings? If you're not producing seedlings, of course, you don't care. But there are some trees out there that have a reputation for producing lousy seedlings and others that produce good seedlings consistently. Again, Eaton is a good tree to discuss here because Eaton does not have a great reputation for producing good seedlings. I don't know why. A lot of people have said this. I think that at one point, Greg Miller was using Eaton in his breeding program, and I think he dropped it. And I haven't talked to Greg about that, but I'm guessing that that would have been a problem. It just doesn't produce a high percentage of good seedlings.
Hey,
On the
Michael,
other hand,
sorry, Michael.
go ahead.
I don't mean to interrupt, but we had talked during our earlier session that to give you sort of a time check. And in the interest of time, do you want to move on to maybe some of the more specific cultivars, so we can get to some questions after too? Not that
Okay.
this isn't fascinating, because it is, but just in the interest of time.
Okay, and the only thing I had left here was, does your tree hold leaves in the winter? That's important if you get snow in the winter, because those leaves will hold snow and you can break branches. And then there's many trees have ornamental features, but that's not really an issue in the United States. Then I was going to discuss cultivar qualities for nuts, and that is, this is stuff that I think most of you know about. The size of the nuts. Do they peel well? Single or multiple embryos? More than 3 nuts per burr? Of course, how do they taste? Do they store well? Do they have split shells? Do the nuts have IKB, internal kernel breakdown? Do the nuts have brown rot? Do they tend to develop blossom end rot? And those are things you need to be aware of when you're picking out a cultivar, particularly for commercial growers. And the one thing I wanted to mention there from that is with respect to the size of nuts, is that there really are 2 distinctively different ways that chestnut trees produce nuts, in the sense that some trees are very consistent with respect to nut size. And if you pick up nuts from a tree, 90% are all going to be nearly the same size. And there are other trees that don't do that. They produce variable sized nuts. And the poster child for this is Colossal. And Colossal is, a very widespread commercial cultivar on the West Coast and even in Michigan. And everyone knows that Colossal produces huge nuts. But what it also produces, it produces the huge nuts, it produces large nuts, it produces medium-sized nuts, and it produces small nuts. And I'm just going to show you here for a minute. Can everyone see this?
No, that's not showing. Only the Word document is showing.
Okay.
If you want to try again, you can reshare, and be sure to share the whole screen and not just the Word document.
Okay, I see. I've got to figure out how to do that then. Okay, somebody needs to help me. How can I unshare the Word document and instead share the screen?
So, well, I can go ahead and do that for you.
Okay.
Because I have that power.
Cool. Okay, so are we in the screen now?
So if you click the green button at the bottom that says share screen, and in the upper left-hand corner, your first option should say screen.
Okay, I see it.
And then that'll share whatever you're looking at the time. There you go.
Okay. Okay, these are small colossal chestnuts. And this is not a rarity. Every colossal tree is going to produce all 4 sizes of nuts. So this is something to be aware of with respect to cultivars, is whether or not a particular cultivar you're interested in has, large nuts only, or whether it has large nuts, small nuts, etc. And with respect to cultivars, there are 2 locations I want to discuss specifically. In Brownsville, California, there is a 5-acre cultivar collection that was planted from 1916 to 1920. This cultivar collection was intended to have every good cultivar that was grown in the United States at that point in time, and it probably came very close to doing that. Unfortunately, the map to this orchard was lost in a fire about 40 or 50 years ago, and none of the trees are tagged, so we don't know what is what. I have identified probably 2 trees in that orchard, the 2 easiest, Paragon and Colossal. And other than that, we would assume that all of the old cultivars that were popular in the 1910 to 1920 area on the East Coast are probably in this orchard, but we don't really have any easy way to identify them. The other, let me show you just a few photos to give you some idea. Is that visible?
Yes.
Okay. This is, one of the pictures of the trees in this old cultivar collection. We've got a few more. This is where it is. This is Chestnut Grove, planted in 1916. And this is one of the trees in that orchard, and it kind of shows what has been happening there over the last 100 years. What you see here is a bunch of root sprouts and what may be the actual original grafted tree. If you look at the third sprout from the left, you'll see growth that is not as vigorous. That is probably the original grafted tree. All of these others are root sprouts, and you'll see that on a lot of the trees in this orchard. And in some of these trees, they have actually lost the graft. The graft is gone, it has died. But it is a fascinating orchard. It is a fun place. If you ever get the chance to go through it, it's absolutely fun because there are Japanese trees, Japanese hybrid trees, European American hybrids, European Japanese hybrids, pure European trees. I have not clearly identified a pure American tree there, but there may be a couple of pure American trees there. One of the things that I think a lot of people don't understand about what was being planted on the West Coast 100, 150 years ago is that people weren't planting a lot of American trees. They were planting European trees or European hybrids. And the reason they were doing this was because the nuts were larger. The nuts were larger, the trees produced more nuts, and it was just a better alternative. If the year is 1880, you're not really concerned about where a chestnut tree came from. You're not really concerned about the genetics. All you know is you want the biggest, highest quality nuts you can get. And so that means that people that came to the West were planting a lot of European hybrids. The other problem is that, of course, there were American trees, pure American trees planted, but a lot of those trees died because they didn't have the drought tolerance that the European trees did. So certainly in this Brownsville orchard, they probably did plant some pure American hybrids or pure American cultivars, but it's not clear that any have survived. The problem, of course, in Brownsville, California, as in much of California, is that basically from April to October, you have no rainfall. So if the tree is not very drought tolerant, it's not going to survive. The other area in California that is interesting in terms of cultivars is Nevada City, California. And this is not because there is a cultivar collection there, but because it is a birthplace of cultivars. Nevada City, California was the home of the Barron Hill Nursery, which was started by a Frenchman, Felix Gillet, in the 1880s. And after he passed away, it was perpetuated and the name was changed to Felix Gillet Nursery. And his wife and others kept running that nursery. That nursery was responsible for the trees that later became Colossal and Nevada, two well-known cultivars. Also in Nevada City growing, there is a tree I call Longstreet. Longstreet is a probable American European hybrid. The nut quality is superb. And here are the nuts. Nuts peel very easily, have wonderful flavor. It's a better nut than the Paragon nut, but it's just basically a random street tree in Nevada City. Another tree, NCC1, is also a probable American dentata hybrid growing in Nevada City. Very good nut quality, better than the nut quality in Paragon. Then you have this one, NCC6, which I like to show photos of just because the nuts are absolutely gorgeous. If I can just find it here. I'm not seeing it, just a second. Here we go. Can everybody see that one? Okay. NCC6 is a very complex hybrid. Nuts drop very late. Nuts peel very well. Tree is heavily productive. The only problem it has, it doesn't have enough flavor in the nuts, but that would make it very good for breeding in any event. But that's one of the fascinating things about Nevada City is that you see all different kinds of chestnut trees with all different kinds of qualities. It is a fascinating place for chestnuts. Next, we have 18 of the best West Coast cultivars. And these are trees that I picked out just because they have a good combination of qualities. The first one we have listed here is Bergance. Bergance is a sativa crenata hybrid that is actually growing in an orchard near Placerville, California, but probably descended from some of the Nevada City trees. It is a very, very high quality nut, very productive tree. This is what the nuts look like. Very large nuts. They peel very well, and the flavor is very good.
Hey, Michael,
Yes.
it's about 12:30. So,
Okay.
and one of my favorite things that you do, Michael, is take these just amazing pictures. So I'm sorry to cut you off and showing some of these. Maybe you can do that while we ask some questions. But being that it's 12:30, are there any things that you'd like to sort of round out with before we go to the Q&A?
Now let's just look at some photos here for a minute then.
Okay.
Without being, without sticking to the format of the written document. Let's just look at some fun photos.
That one that you showed of Bergance, is that the biggest nut cultivar? No.
No, the biggest is Judea.
Okay.
And here we go with some Judea nuts.
While you do that, I do want to say Hill Craddock says, let him go for another hour. I would stick around, Hill, for sure.
One of the nice qualities of Judea is not only are the nuts very large, but when they drop a little early, they have these beautiful colors. They're just really gorgeous. And they get huge, absolutely huge. And the nice thing about Judea too is that the tree grafts extremely well. And these nuts are single embryo nuts. There are no double embryos here, and they peel very well. Another big one that we see is Bouche de Bézizac. This is an import from France. Nuts get very large. Doesn't have the flavor or sweetness of Judea or Bergance, but still a good quality nut for commercial growers. Here is the one I mentioned. I was going to mention specifically from Portugal. This is Judea. This is a photo that was taken by someone in Portugal. Very, very high quality European nut. And then we have Ching, the Eastern US tree that we long considered to be Mellissima. Is probably actually a Mellissima pumila hybrid. Very high quality nuts, very, very sweet nuts.
Michael, a Mellissima pumila hybrid, would that have happened spontaneously, or did someone make that cross?
Someone made that cross. The Tennessee Valley Authority back in the 1940s was working specifically with pumila Mellissima hybrids, and they even had a pumila cultivar. I can't remember what the name of it was, but it was a giant pumila, and it's not clear it was pure pumila or whether it was itself a hybrid, but they were doing crosses with this large pumila tree, and their trees are spread throughout Kentucky and Tennessee, and that's where Ching came from, is from Western Kentucky. This is another pure Chinese here, Yixin orange, very, very tasty nuts and also very pretty nuts. This is one that Hill Craddock was working with in Tennessee. Oops. This one is not gonna, here we go. This is Payne, a nice productive tree.
Hey, Michael, so Hill actually asked at the beginning, how many cultivars did you bring from California when you moved? Someone else wanted to know where you're at. He's in Missouri. So how many did you bring over when you moved?
I don't know because I haven't counted them. I have probably at least 50. This is one here I probably don't have. This is Pandora. Pandora is interesting. It was, this was a controlled pollination. I took a Melissamus seguin seedling and I pollinized it with pollen from a Luther Burbank tree that is popularly called stump sprout. And stump sprout is one of the few remaining Luther Burbank trees in Sebastopol, California. Well, it was at the time I did this. It has since been cut down. But stump sprout had very large nuts, heavily productive tree, and the flavor was decent. And the problem with a lot of the Luther Burbank trees is flavor is not decent, and the nuts don't peel. But this one, the nuts did peel, and the flavor is decent. So this is a cross between the Luther Burbank hybrid and a Seguin Melissima hybrid. Nut quality is excellent. Flavor is very good. And this has been grown by a grower in Missouri for, I think, 15 to 20 years with no signs of blight, which doesn't mean it can't get blight, but so far no blight in Missouri.
Hey, Michael, I've had a couple people ask this question because you had that amazing list of traits, and I've had two people now ask, and Sandy, I know in your 2013 listing of the cultivars, you had some of those traits at the top, and how the different cultivars listed in the 2020 update, it didn't look like those are there. Is there a comprehensive index of all of these cultivars and those traits of interest? Is there any interest in doing that? I mean, I see a lot of interest both in these questions and also for myself of having a comprehensive guide of how these cultivars fall out with these qualities.
Well, one of the problems is that I was having to list all of the names. So people who want to name something can look at the list and see that name's been used before or not. And I didn't have room on that page for all of the qualities that we needed. And initially, I was trying to put in important qualities. And eventually somebody's going to have to do that, just as somebody's going to have to take over as cultivar registrar. But the problem is that, of course, these characteristics are different depending on where you are. If you're on the West Coast, of course, you grow European Japanese cultivars. If you're in the southeastern United States, you grow Chinese. If you're in the northeastern, you probably want trees that have lots of European genes and Japanese genes, because those do best in the northeast, whereas the Chinese don't do quite as well. So it's hard to list cultivar characteristics when we're talking about so many different climates and conditions.
It sounds like there's a place for like some sort of database to hold all this information and have it aligned with the site impact. So I've got a couple other, there are so many questions, guys. So I hope you don't mind me peppering you all with questions. Michael, you might be, do you know the Judea cultivar?
Judea.
And does it do, what's that?
Judea.
Judea, does it do well in Puerto Rico?
I don't think it would do well in Puerto Rico. It's from Portugal. And it's a typical European cultivar, just with an exceptionally good nut.
Somebody's been talking about it on Facebook. I think he's from Turkey, isn't he? That Facebook website, that Facebook group,
yes,
is really important if you're interested in chestnuts as a nut crop. And it's one that Michael manages.
So it's called
Michael?
chestnuts as a tree crop, Castania species nut trees. Is that correct?
Right.
That's correct.
So I posted that name in there. Well, we have a link on the Chestnut Chat website too. So I highly recommend that. I agree. That's a fascinating group to follow and get information on. And I know, Michael, you post a lot of those amazing photos. That's a great place to get more of that after today. I have another question here. So Lisa wants, what's the best cultivar pair for Northern New Jersey? And I'm sure that there's a lot of that question. Michael, in your Word document, you have the top 20 cultivars for the East and the top 20 cultivars for the West, and then some others that people could pick. How does someone go about picking a cultivar from that list? Is there a known process? Is it trial and error? How does someone do that?
Well, to a large extent, it's trial and error. And one thing I wanted to bring up today is that seedlings versus grafted trees. This is a huge issue, and I'll make it much simpler. If you're in the West, if you're on the West Coast, plant grafted trees. If you're on the East, plant seedlings. And it doesn't mean you can't plant some grafted trees in the East, but if you're going to have a large commercial orchard, you should not have all of your eggs in the grafted tree basket, because grafted trees, grafted Chinese trees, do not reproduce their qualities as well as grafted European trees. So if your idea, like for example here, this is black satin, this is a pure Chinese tree. If you want to plant a graft of this in New Jersey, for example, the nuts are not going to be this large, probably. It's still this is a very tasty nut, so you're not going to lose by grafting it, but there's a lot of graft union failures in the East on Chinese trees because they're not as vigorous as European trees. So keep that in mind. People who want to grow a commercial orchard in the East, don't put all of your eggs in that basket of grafted trees. And I would say, plant a lot of seedling trees, top work some of those, and then buy some grafted trees for seed nuts, etc. But yes, the point you made is that you kind of do need to see what does well in your area. And that's where networking with other growers is very, very important, because there are some trees that are going to do really well in the New Jersey climate, but they're not going to do well in, say, Alabama. So you kind of have to know what is going to work in your area, because the United States is just a huge place with a lot of different climate regions, and you aren't going to know with some of these trees until you actually plant them.
So I'm going to I'll put a plug in for the Northern Nut Growers Association and also the Chestnut Growers of America. I know that several of us are members of all organizations, including the American Chestnut Foundation. These are great places to network. That your Facebook page, Michael, is fantastic way to do that. I had a question in here. Oh shoot, I lost it. About cold tolerance, zone 5. You had mentioned cold tolerance as a trait that's really important to breed for. Do you have anything that you recommend for the more northerly climates that meet some of those late leaf out, late flowering characteristics?
Well, it kind of depends on where you are, because zone 5 if you're in Iowa and your zone 5 is going to be different than New York in zone 5, and that's different than Idaho in zone 5. But having said that, you really have to know, you just have to know what does well in your area, because grafted trees in colder climates are going to die more often. Generally, American trees or American hybrids are going to deal with cold weather better, but there are Chinese trees that do fine in zone 5. And for example, Red Fern Farm in Iowa, which sells trees, has a variety they call Resilient, because after they had a couple of really, really nasty winters, Resilient still was producing normally. Where 90% of their trees were having difficulty producing nuts because of horrible winter weather, Resilient was just going on like nothing happened. And you can buy seedlings of Resilient from that nursery. So there's a lot of individual little trees like this that you kind of have to customize to your individual environment. I don't think I'm going to need Resilient in southern Missouri, but who knows? This winter may prove me wrong. But it just requires knowing your climate and knowing a lot about your different options, because the problem a lot of beginning growers have in chestnuts is they don't know their options. And that's one reason why in the Word document I provided here, I have a list of cultivars at the bottom that are just, these are most of the cultivars that we have in the United States. And if you don't know what these cultivars are, then find out, come to a Facebook page, or either Northern Nut Growers or the Chestnut page, or talk to people. But wherever you are, there's probably something that will work very well where you are. It's just, you got to find it.
Well, the other thing is that I can say that for the Northeast, we have pretty cold winters and relatively short seasons. So a lot of the cultivars from Connecticut are being tested out at Perfect Circle Farm in Vermont. So if you're interested in things that will survive in a very cold climate with a fairly short season, look at Perfect Circle, because Buzz Furher has tested a lot of Connecticut cultivars and a lot of others as well. And he doesn't sell anything until it's been through a couple of seasons to make sure that it's going to survive in the frozen north. For the frozen north, I still think S8 Jap and its seedlings are total winners. But check with Perfect Circle Farm for that.
I think Buzz is on here. I'm pretty sure that's that Buzz. And he says, can Mike post that list to the Facebook page? I don't know, Mike, if you want to provide, we've got that linked to the TACF page. I'm not sure how easy it is to share documents on Facebook. But that is on the Chestnut Chat webpage too.
Yeah, I will post this into the Facebook group.
Okay, fantastic. So there's two big questions I want to ask before we've only got 15 minutes left to go. Lots of people asking, how do we figure out the background of my hybrid? So Sandy, you talked about Jean Romero-Severson, who's got some techniques. I know TACF is working on creating a genomic reference panel to do this stuff as well. None of them are publicly available yet. I can speak maybe a little bit to the TACF side. Sandy, what do you know about Jean's techniques and how available they are for folks to use?
Jean is now developing additional markers for European, which is why I just sent her a whole box full of European stuff that I have growing in Connecticut. And when she has gotten all of the markers that she feels are adequate, then she's hoping to be able to provide that as a service. So she'll charge something and you'll pay your money and get information on the background of your cultivars. And this is something that she did with her butternut stuff. She did the same thing with butternut, and you could send her stuff and she'd tell you what this tree was back 3 generations. So
that's great. I'm very happy that she's planning on doing that. Michael, I want to go back to this, but you just shared another picture. Do you want to talk about that one?
Well, I just put these up because these are Paragon nuts.
Oh,
okay.
Good.
Because we've talked about Paragon so much.
Paragon. So there's actually 2 more questions that I want to get to after that one. So so I'm glad Jean's going to have that available to growers. I know TACF, we're working on a different type of genomic referencing. Jared Westbrook is putting together that panel, which will similarly be able to genotype backgrounds and tell the amount of hybridization that's in a given tree. It's great to have multiple tools. So I expect both of those tools to probably be available maybe end of 21, early 22 is kind of the timeline that we're looking for. Sandy, would you say that's right?
I don't know. It depends on whether we all survive the pandemic. Some of us are rather old.
I believe that everyone's going to make it through this. The folks that are on here, at least you have to.
Yes.
The other question Marshall asks, and I got a couple more of them, but how do we get scion wood from these cultivars? Is there a place to trade scion wood or access that or purchase it? How do we do that?
If you want stuff from Connecticut, tell me. And I will connect, I will, not now, but next year, I'll collect cyanwood and sell it to you, send it to you. If you're a commercial nursery, I'm supposed to charge you for it, but there are other nurseries selling this stuff, I know. Clifford, England sells cyanwood. I think Buzz probably does too in Vermont. I don't know about Bernie in Washington. Michael, do you know if Bernie sells cyanwood?
He used to. I think he stopped because I think he feels he's competing with himself when he sells cyanwood.
Yeah. Well, I'm just happy to have this stuff being propagated. That's one reason I was so happy that Perfect Circle Farm was willing to take this on as a project. I fixed my slide with my webpage if you want me to share it, Sarah.
Sure, go ahead.
I can't share screen while Michael's up.
Yeah, there you go. He did it. All right, so let's answer a few more questions. We talked about this during practice and we didn't get to it. Lots of questions. What's Dunstan?
It's a Chinese chestnut, a random Chinese chestnut.
Well, Dunstan, first of all, is not a cultivar. It is absolutely not a cultivar. Dunstan is a trade name for seedlings produced from 7 or 8 cultivars that they do have. The cultivars have names like Revival and Carpenter and Willamette, but they don't sell the cultivars anymore. They used to sell the cultivars in the 1990s and they quit selling them. So they only sell seedlings now. And so the seedlings, you're just getting random Dunstan seedlings. We don't know what the parents are. You might get a seedling from Revival, in which case it might be pretty vigorous and pretty good, or you might get a seedling from Willamette, in which case it won't be as good, most likely. So you're just getting random seedlings, but they are not. Dunstan is not a cultivar, and a lot of people think it is, and I'm not sure why, but Dunstan is not a cultivar.
It's a trademark.
Yeah.
It's also not an American chestnut. A lot of people think it's an American. It's a mostly Chinese. It's about 95% plus Chinese chestnut.
Yeah, Jean Romero Severson looked at several of the cultivars and they were mostly Chinese. So you know that if the cultivars are mostly Chinese, then the seedlings are going to be essentially Chinese.
And so we're talking. So I know Steve Jeffers. Hi, Steve. Thanks for. He always puts a lot of stuff in the chat, and I appreciate that. He wanted to again. He brought up the difference between a cultivar and a variety, which you described at the beginning. And so Mike Alcott. Hi, Mike. He's a great grower of chestnuts in the great northern tier of Pennsylvania. He says, given that cultivars such as Sleeping Giant are hybrids, if you have many of them growing together and pollinating one another, will you get wide variation in phenotype among offspring? For example, could some offspring be significantly more blight resistant, more cold tolerant, etc.?
Of course. Of course.
Okay.
And a variety, if you're going to talk about a variety means pink flowers, early flowering. It's some general category that you would use to describe a characteristic of the plant. But a cultivar is a clone. And a variety, you can have cultivars which are pink flowered or have red leaves or whatever, and those might be considered varieties. But we don't really use that term very much in chestnut because most people are not interested in the ornamental characteristics.
Woodland Dave brings this up, and Sandy, I know this for a fact since I followed it. If you do join the Facebook group, anybody who does that, and you make a post, be sure to tell everybody where you're at, or Sandy will be very cross with you. So, warning: be sure to list your location when asking questions in that group.
Yes.
Let's see. Tom wants to know, where can you get cyan for Brigance and Gillette?
I don't know anywhere where you can actually get the sign wood now that Bernie does not sell it. I think what Bernie wants you to do is he wants you to buy the grafted trees.
Good. Buy trees from Bernie. Support Bernie. He's doing good things.
Michael, those two places in California you listed, are they, can the public go see them? Are they open to the public? Are they private locations? What?
Well, Nevada City is, just a city, and you can walk around Nevada City and you can see chestnut trees all over. And so anybody can walk around. You can't always access every single tree you can see because they'll be in somebody's backyard, but you can see a lot of street trees there. And with respect to the Chestnut Grove, on my written document, I think I put in a link to its Facebook page. There is a Facebook page for the Chestnut Grove. What they do primarily, they use the Chestnut Grove for weddings, for concerts, for other kinds of meetings. It's a beautiful place in the summer to go. And the guy who owns it is a really, really, really nice guy. If you call him up or contact him through the Facebook page and tell him you want to go there, odds are about 99% he'll say, sure. But do not go there without contacting him because the odds are very good that you'll get arrested for trespassing. So he's a great guy. Just ask him, tell him you want to see it, and he will be good to you. Good
to know. What is Bernie's nursery? Kevin asks.
Washington Chestnut Company.
Okay. Has Castania henryi been successfully crossed with C. dentata?
I haven't bothered.
I think it has. I know Gary Carver did some crosses. He got, so he has some dentata on his property in Maryland and then crossed it with henryi pollen from the National Arboretum. So there are some henryi crosses floating around, but I don't know how they're looking.
Well, when I've been interested in timber trees, I have not considered including henryi in the cross. We have a few henryi in Connecticut.
And Hill says that he crossed some henryi with dentata in Tennessee. Roger Stillwater asks, when I get seeds from the American Chestnut Foundation, which cultivar am I getting? You are not getting a cultivar. They're not grafted. They're not clonally propagated. They're seedling derived trees, and they're crosses of American chestnuts and Chinese chestnuts that have been back crossed to Americans, but they're not cultivars. At least none are yet.
They're hybrids.
They are hybrids. Pietro Catazone, and I apologize for butchering that name. It seems that recently some of my trees I'm getting late second bloom and burrs, but there's not enough time for them to mature. Why is this happening?
And where are you?
I didn't say. Dan Lefevre, and I've heard Dan's name. He says that freeze out of early emerged growth, and he's seen that in his Dunstans where the whole crop was lost. He's in Central Virginia. I've seen that happen on almost all trees. In our orchards, we see a lot of secondary flowering, that don't necessarily seem to be related to frost or freeze injury. It seems to kind of be something that chestnuts do. They put out this second crop for some reason, and I don't know why.
Well, in California in zone 9, we would have a lot of flowers, the second flowering. And I think it's just an expression of the vigor of the tree. If the tree has produced a first crop and there's still a lot of heat and a lot of sunlight, some trees, not all, but some trees will produce another crop. And one of the most spectacular was Judea, which would set nuts in late September, early October, and still produce a normally huge nut in December. So that's kind of an extreme, but it just depends on the individual tree.
Tony Cicelli in Florida has some really interesting stuff, and he sometimes gets 3 crops in a season. Huh. And Tony has posted this on Facebook, and I know that because it's really hot in the area where he's growing stuff, he's getting repeated flowering, not just with things that have chinkapin in their genotype.
So guys, we're 4 minutes to 1 o'clock. I actually have another Zoom at 1 that I have to shut down. This could go on for a long time. This has been so much fun. I really appreciate you both, both for all the time you've put in to setting these up. You guys spent an hour with me on the practice session and get everything up. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This was really fun. There's so much more here to talk about. There's a lot more questions in the Q&A. I'm going to try and get to some of these, and I might send them to Sandy and Michael to see if they can't help me create some of these answers. Join the Facebook group. There's amazing, great discussion on there all the time that can follow up on this. Definitely join the American Chestnut Foundation. Lisa's going to kill me, but the Chestnut Growers Association of America and the Northern Nut Growers Association of America, they do a lot of really great work too with things that aren't American chestnut. They sometimes work with American chestnuts too, but they're great to continue this kind of conversation as well. Any last words, Sandy, Michael, and then I'm going to turn it over to Lisa.
American chestnuts are timber trees. They're important for increasing the diversity in the forest. But if you want nuts, you want some kind of hybrids or Chinese, and you need to look for cultivars. Michael?
No, I agree.
All right, I linked that Facebook group. We've had lots of questions of people wanting to join that, so that Facebook link is linked there in the chat. It's also on the Chestnut Chat webpage. Lots of great background and information. Thank you, Lisa, if you want to bring it on home.
Sure thing. Thanks, Sarah. Great job facilitating all those questions, and we'll try to get to them, as she said, later on. Madam Chestnut, Sandy, you're awesome. Mike, it's so great to get to know you and your lifelong work with Chestnut. And as far as all those groups, heck yeah, join them all, especially the American Chestnut Foundation. Can't help but say that. All boats will rise. Everyone is interested in this species. It's the longevity of the interest always amazes me and inspires me. So thank you all so much. And to our esteemed guests and our fabulous facilitator, Sarah and Kendra in the background, doing all kinds of work and with the chat and the Q&A. Thanks, everybody. Sorry we have to run.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you, guys.